Back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Juventus versus Porto in the UEFA Champions League played today, and it's going to be a tactical analysis of both teams using Keyframe. The link will be in the description below, and let's get right into it. So with Morata and Cristiano Ronaldo as the two forwards, Juventus pressed with two players in their front line of pressure. Countering this, Porto built from the back using their goalkeeper, splitting both their central defenders, so drawing out the Juventus players into a higher field position, moving up the field to then create space in the wide areas to progress through, and stretching Juventus's 4-4-2 or some sort of variation from this. And they built with a single pivot through the central corridor, and the key players were the wide players to then take advantage of the pressing of the Juventus players to then try and progress through the lower density areas. So from here, then the wide midfielder would jump from Juventus to press the ball, and attached would then be the midfielders connected to the player pressing. And then covering was the furthest away central midfielder, acting as the defensive midfielder in this situation, and his role is primarily protecting the space around where you would commonly think of as the 10 space, where the number 10 operates, and the attacking midfielders and inverted wide players. So with this, the fullback on the ball would have immediate pressure, and the player jumping to press would be using his cover shadow to block any vertical passes, which oftentimes led to deflections and then more set pieces for Porto through throw-ins and tackles, and 1v1 situations were often taken advantage of by Porto, and players jumping, then the space access would then be in behind. But Porto's midfielders were very much capable of being very vertically mobile in terms of moving back towards the ball to decrease connections and allow for faster play through a high pressure situation. And here we can see the Juventus, their man orientation in the pressing phase. So from here we can just see how they line up and become very man oriented, as many teams do, in their high block, and even the jumping, while still maintaining a free player through their holding midfielder to cover the space and use their cover shadow to block entry passes into a higher player into their attacking players. So Juventus's build-up structure was quite unique, as it usually is. Their goalkeeper split the two central defenders, and now their double pivot operated in a unique manner, with the relationship of Aaron Ramsey in the first half also basing his position off the double pivot. So Arthur would often drop deeper, staggering the two double pivots, and then this would ignite the movement of Ramsey to then come deeper to fill this role. So as the Porto players would then jump to press the ball into a higher area, Ramsey would then come closer to the first line of pressure to offer a shorter option pass to then break this pressure in a more controlled way. Juventus also played with deeper fullbacks and more narrow fullbacks, using minimum width to then decrease the distance it would take for the ball to circulate from the first line of build-up into the wide areas and the fullbacks. This would then give them closer connections to the first line as well as the central players, and allow their movement to then end up closer to their teammates and allowing tighter connections through the center corridor. So from here, the deeper fullbacks also made them pretty useful when pressure started to build higher up the field, and it would prevent players from getting isolated, but it also put them in a less opportunistic position in terms of being able to attack. But Juventus's big concept they used was drawing the press forward so that they can then use the space in behind the press, as we see here. A huge amount of space left from in behind the press of the players and between the lines, and it really separates the first and second line of pressure from their rest defense in their defensive phase through their last line of defenders and their defensive midfielders. This will then give the Juventus players, especially the holding midfielders, the opportunity to jump into this space. So as they pull the first line, second line of pressure forward, it gives the midfielders the opportunity to then jump into the space behind the pressure. Moving into the midfield third, Juventus still play with their double pivot, but now their double pivot usually staggers themselves, and this staggering comes in the moments when they look to build strong connections in the wide area with their deep fullbacks again, as we see here. But these tight connections between the staggering of the double pivot put them in closer proximity to the fullbacks and the near side forward, as well as the wide advanced player. So these wide rondo situations are very common and are derived from the movement of the holding midfielder who staggers themselves higher up the field. So from here, we also have players coming narrow like Aaron Ramsey playing between the lines, and then the two forwards, Ronaldo and Morata, playing very narrow and trying to pin the entire Porto back four into more of a back five or even a back six, as the fullbacks and wide players on Juventus narrow or further up the field they advance their runs. So as we see Cuadrado at the bottom of our screen, the free player advancing from his deep position further up the field, which allows him to go relatively unmarked over a large vertical distance, while the Porto players and their compact block are drawn towards the ball from here. And we even see a makeshift back five because of the orientation of the wide players from Porto to the fullbacks of Juventus. So could be an opportunity for Juventus to progress around the defensive block and in behind, and the hyper compactness horizontally and vertically left these channels open to players then advancing further forward. So here again, we often see Porto's defense in more than just a back four, often a back five, and sometimes even a back six, because of the orientation of the wide players, as we said, to the Juventus players, so the wide midfielders, to the Juventus fullbacks, and when they advance, it requires a player to drop into the last line of defense, and because of the covering of players like Cristiano Ronaldo and Alvaro Morata, and even Aaron Ramsey or a deeper midfielder moving into these areas to occupy the defenders in the last line. This was a huge tendency for Juventus to always pin the back line of Porto using two players, which would then try and free up movement from Aaron Ramsey, Rabiot, and Arthur in a deeper position and asymmetric midfield formation. And this would also allow for narrow fullbacks to then advance through underlapping situations, and Ronaldo to use positional interchanges and fluidity to occupy wider areas, as well as have the freedom to go through the center of the field. So one last time, the asymmetry in their build-up phase, two center backs and a staggered fullback situation with Cuadrado on this near side here going higher up the field, Alexandro holding his deeper position. Then we have the double pivot, staggering themselves again, varying their heights. The one closest to the ball oftentimes goes deeper, connecting the first line of build-up and using press-resistant structures to then maintain these high levels of circulation. We have our two forwards, oftentimes using asymmetry and off-centered, and as well as players often running in behind and more players occupying the defensive line from Porto, forcing them to use more players in their last line of defense to accommodate for Juventus's forward play and their high level of players in the last line of their attack, allowing then players like Aaron Ramsey to operate in the blind side of Porto's midfield and arrive in the 10 area and arrive in the half space from these midfielders' blind spots, going often unmarked by a defender because of the pinning of the other Juventus players, like we see Morata here pinning two defenders, allowing Ramsey to be free and occupy a situation that you'd often associate with the number 10. So from here, we have Juventus's double pivot, oftentimes getting on the ball in front of the Porto defensive block, which often played into Porto's hand and benefited them more than anybody else, because as the ball was in front of them, it was more easy to deal with and maintain their compactness. And having so many players occupy their line of defense, it allowed them to stay in more control of the space, as well as not have to worry about players between the lines and the variability in movement, other than the rondo situations we see forming in the wide area by advancing fullbacks and staggered midfielders, as well as interchanging front players, creating these rondo situations in the wide area, while the double pivot would then get on the ball in front of the block. But more or less, when the ball was in front of Porto's block, they remained comfortable and they didn't have to worry about a high level of players between the lines. They were very much intra-line, which made the decision making on Porto relatively easy. So again, we see midfielders dropping in front of the Porto line, and then we see an over-occupation of the last line from Porto, giving them a high volume of players in their last line of defense, allowing them to then jump and always maintaining this numerical superiority from the Porto defense in their last line of defense. And this often aided in them controlling crossing situations, which was a high concern going into the match because of Juve's aerial threat and something they looked to exploit. But with this being said, the wide players from Porto followed the fullbacks and the shifting of Ronaldo into the wide areas, and then when they would go into the last third of the field, they would have the numerical advantage to deal with Juve's qualitative advantage in the air. So here, again, we see moving into the last third, usually Morata, Ronaldo, and whoever else joins the attack would then move to the weak side from where the cross will be brought in from. As we see here, they're all on the weak side, playing in the blind spot of the defenders, ready to attack from the blind side to give them a positional and dynamic advantage when contesting for these aerial duels. And when they went a man down, they almost played with one line of defense and three players in front of them. So almost a 6-3 situation when playing with 10 men, not having a clear outlet, but maintaining this numerical advantage in their last line of defense, maintaining compactness and the numerical superiority when defending in the box. So we see again Porto's low block committing as many players to their line of defense as needed, and not as many players in their midfield line, but we can see here how Juventus commit Alvaro Morata and Cristiano Ronaldo into the box for the cross, and Porto go with three players to then mark either side of these players, giving them the numerical advantage in this situation to overcome the two players' abilities in the air. And as we see, the goalkeeper playing off his line a little bit to give him a greater presence when coming out for these longer crosses, especially from the deep area, as we see Alexandro is here. So here is one situation when Juve scored. When Juve scored, they had an overload between the players, and this is how Juve looked to overcome the numerical advantage from Porto, is they would overload the space between two Porto players, making them virtually unmarkable when they overload the space because of the movement that's created, and then also arriving on the weak side, a player from the wide area. But these players overloading the space between the defensive connections makes it really hard to mark and gives them almost no ability to create positional superiority with both of the players in the box. And an early cross from the wide area allows for them to take advantage of the high line and then take advantage of the space in the box that can't be covered by the goalkeeper coming out for the cross. And this is the space he can look to whip the ball into as the defense is moving towards their own goal, much harder to defend, and set up for a good second ball structure and rest defense through Alexandro, the narrow fullback, holding midfielder, and Cuadrado, the other relatively narrow fullback. And so this was the main trend throughout the entire match. And I just want to make a quick analysis. It was very much a question of defending in a low block, defending crosses, and how Juve look to then make runs through the box, create these situations, and try and take advantage of their aerial qualitative advantage. So thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.